Welcome into a very special video podcast segment of Your Implicit Bias. I'm your host, Kevon Bordelon. We are welcoming in a tremendously special guest and an important guest this week. First of all, no, it's not Caleb Morris, even though you might have thought he was important. Caleb, you're important?
In my own right.
In your own right. Well, let's go ahead and introduce the person who is important in the top secret podcast layer, United States Congressman Clay Higgins. Congressman Higgins, it's a pleasure to have you here.
I'm happy to be here. And let me say, Caleb's very important because he's my armorer.
Well,
he's an important guy, man.
I guess that does make him important.
I'm happy to be here.
So we've sampled some whiskey. We've gone down that road. We have given you our theme and monologue for the week of going to the source. So let's get to the important stuff. Because after all, Congressman Higgins, that's why we are so thrilled to have you on the show this week. Because we know that you know, and you have access to stuff that most of us haven't seen or don't necessarily understand. And when I say that, I say it from this perspective. The mass media, which I addressed those in the monologue, the mainstream legacy, CBS, ABC, NBC, Fox, MSNBC, Vox, all those stupid people who only want to tell you their story, not the story. There's a lot of things that they just haven't passed on to everyday Americans. There are a lot of things, especially when it comes to January 6th, that they don't want to necessarily, and this is going to sound odd for some people, they don't want to tell the truth. So that's really where Caleb and myself and Renee, we really wanted to have a conversation about what is the truth about what happened on January 6th. So I'd like to start with this question because I think we need to. Was there violence in the Capitol on January 6th?
Well, there's violence in the heart of man.
Agreed.
So where man is present, there's a potential for violence, and man was present in the Capitol on January the 6th.
So I'm glad we have that out of the way, because now that we have that men, and we are violent because it is in our flawed human nature.
Since Adam, yes, sir.
Absolutely. That some things happen that we wish wouldn't have happened. But now I think we've got to start getting underneath some of the context of who were those people? I mean, these are the questions that we have to ask. What might have been motivating some of those people? How did some of those people get there? There are 5 questions journalists are supposed to ask. Who, what, when, where, why? And we've only gotten maybe a couple of those. So one of the things that we've heard, and I've actually seen you on social media say, is that there were law enforcement agents, FBI. I've actually seen some reports that say that some of our intelligence agencies had people in that crowd. Is that something that we can take to the bank? And can you help us understand why they would be there?
So I hope I can help Americans that have a mind to seek truth. I hope I can help them understand it. Ultimately, all I can do is speak truth based upon my own investigative effort, which has been tremendous. I've put a lot of energy, man, into determining what happened to my country in 2020 and leading up to January 6th and what happened after January 6th with the J6 Select Committee. And indeed, who were the sponsors of the shiny objects, which is what the mainstream media reports on. In the defense of mainstream media, we have become a society that's only comfortable in consuming like sound bites of data. We largely, as a people, we have stepped away from a calm and quiet assessment of truth. And the media has responded to that by feeding us in segments that work well for their commercial sales and the breaks, and as they roll from a half-hour show to an hour show or whatever. So you have a hard break, you have a soft break, and you have to fit, we're discussing this topic in this segment, and And you have to structure massive amounts of data into a consumable segment and feed it through that medium to the people that are consuming it. So mainstream media is not alone in their responsibility for the way we view our news and the way we consider the narratives of the day wherein our nation is engaged with seeking some deep and profound understanding of sometimes some really bad things that have happened and big betrayals that really deserve more thorough and deep understanding and explanation. So that's where a guy like me comes in. I've invested hundreds of hours that required a great deal of focus into what happened in 2020. And as I observed very powerful factions within our country poised themselves to destroy not only the presidency of Donald Trump and Donald J. Trump the man, but also the mega movement, the America First movement, because an America First Republican conservative American patriot does not fit the agenda of an ever-growing government and an ever-weakened individual liberties and freedoms of the American citizenry. We have allowed this to take root in our country in the course of my generation. I'll be 63 in a couple of months. So in 1961, you had a totally different country, man, the year I was born. And of course, we have evolved and grown as a nation in some ways in a very excellent manner, in some ways quite injurious to our potential future. And the what we call the establishment factions of that have political power and economic power in America, they rely upon the growth of the federal government. And no matter what party is in charge of the White House, the legislative branch, Congress, or where the tilt is on the federal bench, the establishment politicians and the private sector, they rely upon the growth of government. And this is why they never really argue if you have a W in the White House or you have an Obama in the White House. They don't really care about that. They'll make noise, but as long as the government continues to grow and the oppressive power of regulatory control continues to grow, and never-ending wars and conflicts are continually fed through the military-industrial complex, and the associated deterioration of individual rights and liberties and freedoms and sovereignty of our states continues on that trend, and the ever-growing debt of the American people continues to grow, then the establishment wins. So when Trump came along, he brought an alarming halt to that crap. And the establishment freaked out, man. And COVID was born.
If I'm hearing you right, because you've given us a lot there. There's a lot to what you said. And I want to make sure that I understand it. So I'm going to put it in my words, not yours. But if I'm hearing you right, there is a faction of people, party regardless. They could be R's, they could be D's, they could be W's, they could be Z's. It doesn't matter. But there's a group of people that doesn't want the American people making their decisions with their vote. They want to make the decisions in Washington, D.C. Am I translating that correctly? And some of those might be business people. Some of those might be tied into just being at the teat of the American government. And the larger it gets, the larger that their dollar amount gets as that percentage grows.
Well, yes, sir. They're creating an elitist and a slave class, essentially,
Mhm.
and it didn't happen overnight. The government forces that interfere with our life, everything about us, everything in the studio, everything in this room and home is regulated by the federal government. The founders never envisioned such a thing. I don't know where we got to a point in America where an American citizen could be placed under arrest for getting into his boat and going into the ocean to catch a fish.
Yeah.
That's where we are right now in our country. We have large, powerful factions within our government, and I refer to factions because the founders were concerned with factions, and they were greatly discussed amongst our founders. In Federalist 10, Hamilton, I believe, maybe Madison, said that liberty is to faction as air is to fire, an ailment without which both would expire. And what he meant by that was that the liberty that we were discussing creating in America, the individual rights, liberties, and freedoms, sovereignty of the states, a representative republic, a union of states, this would be an environment wherein factions could be born and given First Amendment rights and Bill of rights. Factions could be born that were actually injurious to the liberties that gave birth to them. And yet none of us would argue that we should eliminate oxygen in order to control fire. So we should never, the founders agreed that we should never weaken liberty in order to control threats to liberty that are born of liberty. So what's the answer? Hamilton and Madison agreed that when faced with internal threat, Americans must respond as a people and become a more powerful faction. This is what's happening right now. This is why if I'm so optimistic, if I seem and feel optimistic, it's because I am. I've read the Bible. I know the ending, and we win. Mm-hmm. And we are becoming, we the people, patriot Americans that love our country. We've witnessed these things happen. We witnessed the oppression of COVID. We witnessed what happened with the election in 2020. We've witnessed the weaponization of the federal government against the people. We've witnessed what happened with our border. We are responding. We're responding. We're becoming a more powerful faction. And this is exactly what the founders envisioned.
We're becoming unified again. I remember after September 11th, you wouldn't go anywhere without seeing an American flag.
Mm-hmm.
And the patriotism and the love for our nation that we felt. And then just a few years later, to where we are now, we're so divided. But yet we're starting to be unified again because we're waking up and we're realizing that it's not the letter next to these factions' name, it's the $sign next to their name.
So are we really more divided? And this is a question that I've always had, even from my years in the news media. Are we really divided, or are we being convinced that we're divided?
It's interesting. That's an interesting question. Would you look to family? Like, I'm the seventh of 8 children, and I have 6 sisters and an amazing brother. And trust me, my family represents every shade of ideology, and yet we love each other and respect each other. And when we get together at family gatherings, we have interesting debates. But we look forward to the next gathering. So my family, I believe, is like a microcosm of the American family. And I just don't buy it that Americans are at each other's throats the way the mainstream media would advise us we are in their sound bites of data.
We have had disagreements on this show. I mean, Sam is a card-carrying communist, for crying out loud. Kidding, he's not. But we've had disagreements on the show, and at the end of the day, the conversation is we have to be able to have the conversation and still be friends afterwards, because if not, we end up in that bad place. But if we can have the conversation and sometimes say, look, we're not going to agree right now, but I still care about you. I still, as St. Thomas Aquinas would say, will the good of other for the sake of other. Just because you're a human being.
So I think that we've touched on some heavy stuff here. If I could, because I don't want to gloss over your question regarding what happened on J6.
We go down rabbit holes. It's okay.
Could I
We'll
summarize
come back to
that?
it. Absolutely. Please do.
So J6 was not just J6. J6 was 2020. And 2020 was defined by COVID oppression. And COVID oppression was born of the birth of COVID. And what was the origin of the birth of COVID is something we may really never know. I mean, investigations commonly, especially worldwide investigations commonly, they never produce a definitive result that the world can agree on. So the fact is, the origins of COVID are quite suspicious to a guy like me. But let's just move past that. COVID was presented to the nation as this nightmarish, like horror story disease that was going to devour us. And so the initial reaction, I think we all get a pass on. I think that across the board, I think Americans and states and governors and the president, politicians, citizenry at the local, state, and federal level, of families, I think we get a pass in the beginning of COVID, like in February of 2020, in March.
Early
April.
on, absolutely.
Early on, man, because we didn't know. It was presented to us as this like the horrible disease that was going to kill everybody and was super contagious. And so we reacted to that. But by the time you were into the summer, we knew. You remember 2 weeks to flatten the curve?
I remember that.
And by the time we went into the summer, we all knew somebody that had it or we had it. It was like, wait a minute. This thing is not that bad.
And you had studies coming out as early as the summer that were saying the survival rate of this particular infection, 97+%, 98+%, unless you had some particular comorbidities, which was very, very similar to the flu.
Scientists and doctors saying early on that the people that are dying are not dying from COVID, they're dying with COVID.
Agreed.
And that this data was being suppressed. And so we were communicating online as Americans concerned about our fellow man and what was going on with this thing. And we started finding that our communications were being oppressed. In the meantime, they shut down our government. They shut down our businesses. They shut down our abilities to travel the land. Our basic freedom, the freedom to travel the land, was strongly curtailed. They started demanding these tests. And the discussions of pushing through the developing a vaccine was pulling a tremendous amount of money. They wouldn't let us congregate in a church. We couldn't send our kids to school. Neighbor was spying on neighbor and calling the police. You had people getting arrested for walking their dog without a mask on. What we were witnessing happening in America was incredibly oppressive. So we started to react to that oppression. And we started to discuss it online. And who was most invested in that discussion? The guys that had put their lives on the line for our freedoms. So you had a bunch of veterans, they're commonly talking on social media threads about what the hell is going on in our country. And the FBI started embedding themselves in those groups. This was by the time you were 4, 5, 6 months into 2020, the FBI was monitoring and embedded into hundreds of online discussion groups. And as these court cases for J6 political persecutions have surfaced, and some of us have seen that evidence that has been forced out of the DOJ into those cases and concealed by protective order by the judges, what can't be released to the media or outside that courtroom, but some of us have seen it. The original seeds of riotous or illegal or occupation-type behavior for amongst these groups were planted by the FBI embedded agents in those groups.
And that's a huge point because it's not illegal for the FBI to embed someone in these particular groups.
It's smart.
It's done consistently by law enforcement.
That's how they dictate control, because they understand the direction they need to go, and then they just give you the push that you need.
But here's the
Well,
problem.
that was the nefarious part.
That's
Caleb.
the part they can't
That was
do.
the-
And that's the part that we're going to have
becomes
to
entrapment.
That's the part that we're going to have to continue after this commercial break, because that is incredibly important. Catch implicit bias when we come back.